Leviticus chapter 14 today. Now, we rushed, quite literally, through chapters 11 through 13. We kind of started running out of time last time, and we kind of rushed through it, and we got kind of this dizzying idea of just how difficult it is to maintain one's cleanliness in Israel. We started to get an idea of just how contaminated, we could say it this way, by the fall we have been. Now, it's been a while since we were here and looking at Leviticus, so let's think through just the logic of Leviticus so far. When we look at a text, we want to always show ourselves where in the book we are. So first of all, where in the book are we? We are, of course, in the book of Leviticus. We could call it the book of holiness. This is the book of holiness. So in Genesis, we saw that man fell. In Exodus, we saw man be redeemed. And now in Leviticus, we are seeing man be sanctified, or we could say holified. Now, you, of course, remember that Israel was brought out of Egypt in the Exodus. They were delivered. They were redeemed out of their bondage in Egypt, and they were brought then into the wilderness. And they came to the mountain called Sinai. Now, that wasn't just a whimsical stop. That was a planned stop. Even when God sent Moses, remember, God told Moses, this will be the sign. You will lead Israel out in order to take them to the land of Canaan, but you're going to come here, and you're going to worship me on this mountain. And of course, within a few weeks, they made it to Mount Sinai. And that's where the narrative pretty much has stopped. And we've been looking at all of these laws because God is now meeting with them, and he has met with them first on Mount Sinai. And he has entered into a covenant with them, just as he entered into the Abrahamic covenant with Abraham. Now he has entered into the Mosaic, what we know as the Old Covenant, with the Jewish nation. And so now he has pledged that he will be their king, he will be their God, and he will be in the midst of Israel. And in order to prepare them for that, he gave them the law. Because we know, if we know one thing, we know that God is holy, and God is righteous, and God is pure, and mankind is not. We're not any of those things. And so in order for God to dwell in the midst of people, in the midst of a nation, something had to happen. So God enters into a covenant with them and tells them that they must be holy. We're going to see this a lot of times coming up. Not tonight, but later. You must be holy because I am holy. Because I am holy. Now, we saw, first of all, God give the regulations for the building of the tabernacle. It had to be built very specifically because it was a shadow of things above. And so just as God spoke to Moses, it had to be done. And we saw that over and over and over at the end of Exodus. And then Moses built it just as the Lord had commanded. And then also they made the garments for the priests just as the Lord commanded them. Then we get into chapter 40 of Exodus. What happens? The glory of God moves from Sinai into the midst of Israel to dwell in the tabernacle. So now you have the Holy of Holies, God himself dwelling in the midst of a sinful people. And now the question is, how can God do that? How can he dwell in the midst of a sinful people? The problem is we don't understand that. We don't understand our depravity. I had a mentor that always used to say, we do not understand the depths of our depravity because of our depravity. Because we ourselves have been so affected by the sin, by the curse, by the fall. Our view of holiness is so incomplete. And so here in Leviticus, we are learning to distinguish or discern, a word that needs to be known by the church today. Discern, how to tell right from wrong, how to tell clean from unclean, how to tell holy from unholy. So in this manner then, Leviticus is instructing us in the holiness of God. It is also instructing us on the holiness required to enter God's presence. And so far, in just the 14 chapters we covered, I hope we're starting to get this picture of impossibility. Impossibility. It's impossible for us to maintain this. And as soon as we maintain, even in these chapters of cleanliness, a state of cleanness, all of a sudden we can slip into uncleanness again. We are so affected by the fall that we live in the midst of its effects, and that those effects pollute us. Now, go back to chapter 10 and look at verse 10. That's kind of the introduction to these laws of cleanliness and uncleanliness. Verse 10 of chapter 10. Remember, this is after the sin of Nadab and Abihu, bringing strange fire before the Lord. Aaron was told not to grieve, and then later in verse 8, the Lord told him, or verse 9, the Lord told him not to drink strong wine or strong drink while he is ministering in the tabernacle. And then verse 10, this is why, so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. In other words, the high priest and all the priests needed to learn how to distinguish, or we'll use our word discern, between holy and unholy, and they needed to learn how to distinguish between clean and unclean. Now, that's for the priests, and we started seeing this, that a lot of this was written directly to the priests, but then it's also given to the people because the entire nation of Israel were supposed to be what? A kingdom of priests, Exodus chapter 19. They all were to be priests. And so they were to learn all of these things so that they could then minister unto the rest of the world. Now, in chapter 11, we started looking at purity in regard to food. Even what we eat was contaminated by the fall. In chapter 12, we started looking at purity with regard to childbirth. Even that thing which was most blessed by God at the creation. Remember the creation mandate? Go, fill the earth, multiply upon it. Even that most blessed thing of childbirth was polluted by the fall. There was also purity with regard to infectious disease. Of course, our bodies are polluted. We don't need to be convinced of this. We know this. You can tell by my voice, I'm not feeling well today. I've had some allergies for the last couple of weeks. And we know our bodies are polluted. And we look forward then to the day when we can eat from the tree of life. We look forward to the day when we are out of these bodies which are fallen. And then chapter 14, we're going to finish up infectious diseases. And then chapter 15, we get into purity with regard to, we'll call it personal hygiene, because it's quite graphic. Personal hygiene. I'll let you use your imaginations a little bit later, because we won't draw a very strong picture in those places. So this teaches us about our depravity, and it teaches us about our need for cleansing, for washing, and even our need for regeneration. It teaches us about the impossibility of attaining righteousness on our own. Now, that's all introduction. Let's get into this. And we have quite a lot of ground to cover, so we'll go kind of quickly. But you're familiar with our method. We'll just start in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing." Now, we remember, of course, that leper and leprosy does not refer to what we actually think of as leprosy. It refers to a range of diseases or a range of things. Now, this leper shall be brought to the priest, and actually the priest shall go to the outside of the camp. So the priest actually has to go to the leper because the leper is unclean. He is outside of the camp because he would defile the camp by coming into it. Thus, the priest shall look, and if the infection of leprosy has been healed in the leper, then the priest shall give orders to take 2 live clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet string, and hyssop for the one who is to be cleansed. The priest shall also give orders to slay the one bird in an earthenware vessel over running water. As for the live bird, he shall take it together with the cedar wood and the scarlet string and the hyssop, and shall dip them, and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was slain over the running water. He shall then sprinkle 7 times the one who is to be cleansed from the leprosy, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the live bird go free over the open field. The one to be cleansed shall then wash his clothes, and shave off all his hair, and bathe in water, and be clean. Now, the priest isn't prescribing medicine to him. He's not practicing what we would think of medicine. He's not working on healing the leper. He's actually prescribing this man, or he is diagnosing the man. If he has leprosy, he's unclean. He cannot be in the camp. If he is not a leper, then he can be in the camp. It's as simple as that. He is protecting the purity of the camp, because it must be pure, because the Lord is in their midst. Now afterward, since he's clean now, he may enter the camp, but that's as far as he can get right now. He may enter the camp, but he shall stay outside his tent for 7 days. So now he can live in the midst of the people, but he can't go in the tabernacle, and he can't even go into his own home for a week. After that week, it will be on the 7th day that he shall shave off all his hair again. He shall shave his head and his beard, even his eyebrows and all his hair. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in water and be clean. Now verse 10, on the 8th day, he is to take 2 male lambs without defect and a yearling ewe lamb without defect. Notice you have 3 animals here, 3 pretty costly animals. And 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. The priest who pronounces him clean shall present the man to be cleansed, and the aforesaid before the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Then the priest shall take the 1 male lamb, and bring it for a guilt offering with the log of oil, and present them as a wave offering before the Lord. Next he shall slaughter the male lamb in the place where they slaughter the sin offering, and the burnt offering at the place of the sanctuary, for the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. Remember, the priest always gets a portion. It is then most holy. The priest shall then take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. You'll remember that's very reminiscent of the ordination of the priests, when they would take the blood and they would do all those 3 things, the ear and the thumb and the big toe, so that it would be symbolized that everything that they do is to be holy. The priest shall also take some of the log of oil, pour it onto his left palm. The priest shall then dip his right finger into the oil that is in his left palm, and with his fingers sprinkle some of the oil 7 times before the Lord. Of the remaining oil which is in his palm, the priest shall make some on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot, on the blood of the guilt offering. While the rest of the oil that is in the priest's palm he shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed, and look at this, circle it. So the priest shall make atonement. He shall make atonement on his behalf before the Lord. The priest shall next offer the sin offering, and, look at it again, make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Then afterward he shall slaughter the burnt offering, and the priest shall offer up the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the priest shall, here it is again, make atonement for him. And only after that, finally after that, he's been pronounced clean several times, but this is the final time. He will be clean. That's a lot to go through. I mean, days and days sometimes of just waiting and waiting and waiting, and then having to go through another ritual, and then more ceremonies, more shaving, more washing. All of this would have really hit upon the people that we are defiled. That we are defiled. And then the fact that they have to go in afterwards to make atonement. I mean, probably they have to make atonement for all the time that he was away from the tabernacle and unable to sacrifice. But also they had to make atonement because of the defilement of the flesh in leprosy. And so finally, clean. Now, notice that there were 3 animals offered, and I said that they were fairly expensive. Now, if you're a leper and you're having to live away from home for quite a while, chances are you didn't have a lot of money. And so if you needed a poor offering, but, verse 21, if he is poor and his means are insufficient, then he is to take 1 male lamb for a guilt offering as a wave offering, check it here, to make atonement for him, right? Has to be a lamb to make atonement, and it has to be an animal. Well, 1/10 of an ephah of the fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, a log of oil, but instead of the other 2 costly offerings, just 2 birds, either 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, which are within his means. So now you get 1 big animal and 2 birds, a little bit more affordable. The 1 bird shall be a sin offering, the other bird will be a burnt offering. Then the 8th day, he shall bring them for his cleansing to the priest. The rest of the ceremony is exactly the same as it was before. It's exactly the same. He shall bring them to the cleansing of the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest shall take the lamb of the guilt offering and the log of oil, and the priest shall offer them as a wave offering before the Lord. Next he shall slaughter the lamb of the guilt offering, and the priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The priest shall also pour some of the oil into his left palm, and with his right hand finger the priest shall sprinkle some of the oil that is in his left palm 7 times before the Lord. The priest shall then put some of the oil that is in his palm on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right foot or hand, and on the toe of his right foot, on the place of the blood of the guilt offering. Moreover, the rest of the oil that is in the priest's palm he shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed. Check it here, to make atonement. And not just to make atonement, but actually gives another explanatory phrase, on his behalf before the Lord. He shall then offer 1 of the turtle doves or young pigeons, which are within his means. He shall offer what he can afford, the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, together with a grain offering. So the priest shall make atonement. Notice where it is, before the Lord. Who is it for? On behalf of the one who is to be cleansed. This is the law for him in whom there is an infection of leprosy, whose means are limited for his cleansing. What do you notice? First of all, it's the same ceremony for the rich and for the poor, or the one who can afford it and the one who cannot. It's the exact same ceremony. They're not treated any differently. The Lord doesn't look at whether someone is poor or whether someone is rich. He gave the means of making the sacrifice to those who didn't have enough money, but he didn't look on it any differently. And to that same effect, what else do you notice? The exact same results, both times. One's not a better result, one's not a worse result, one's not a greater, one's not a lesser. They are both the same. He is cleansed, he is declared to be clean, and he is he is atoned for. He is atoned for. Notice also, every time it says it, it is to make atonement not before the camp, it's before who? The Lord. It's all because of God. Because defilement in his camp is unacceptable. It is not possible to be in the midst of his holiness. And so lepers' uncleanness had to be outside the camp. Notice also it was on his behalf. He had to have a sacrifice. He had to have a substitute. He couldn't do this on his own. He couldn't cleanse himself, and he couldn't make atonement for himself. He needed a substitute to make atonement for him. Now, verse, 33? The Lord further spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when you enter the land of Canaan, so this is already looking to the future. This isn't going to be so much of a problem in tents because, number one, they're moving so much, and then number two, tents are a little bit easier to maintain than a house. If something in a tent goes wrong, you can pitch the tent, throw the tent away, and then you can pitch a new one. When you enter the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put a mark of leprosy on a house in the land of your possession, then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, something like a mark of leprosy. Just scratch the leprosy part. Just say a mark, essentially, at this point. It's some kind of yucky mark. I couldn't think of a better word. Yucky. It's just yucky. I talk to kids all day, okay? Something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house. The priest shall then command that they empty the house. Look at that. Before the priest goes in to look at the mark. Why? So that everything in the house need not become unclean. If this mark is going to make the house unclean, everything in the house and the people that are in the house will become unclean. So before you go get the priest, you lug out all of your stuff and you put it on the curb and hope that nobody takes it. And then you go about getting the priest to look at your house. So he shall look at the mark then, or the priest shall go in to look at the house afterward, and he'll look at the mark, and if the mark on the house or the walls of the house has greenish or reddish depressions and appears deeper than the surface, my technical term, remember, yucky, then the priest shall come out of the house to the doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out. So hopefully you got everybody out before he quarantined it. The priest shall return then after a week and make an inspection. Now here's the fix. If the mark has indeed spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall order them to tear out the stones with the mark in them and throw them away at an unclean place. And of course, where is the unclean place? Outside, not the camp at this point, because we're looking forward to when they're in Canaan, outside the city. He shall have the house scraped all around inside. They shall dump the plaster that they scrape off at an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and replace those stones, and he shall take other plaster and replaster the house. Now, after all of that, and you know how much work that was, now there's another possibility. However, if the mark breaks out again, so taking out all the plaster, taking out all the stones, and redoing it, if it comes back, then the priest shall come in and make an inspection. If he sees that the mark has indeed spread in the house, it is a malignant mark in the house. It is unclean, very costly. He shall therefore tear down the house. Can you imagine that? Somebody comes into your house, sees a spot, and you just have to take the entire house down. You will take its stones, its timbers, all the plaster of the house, and he shall take them outside to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever goes into the house during the time that he has quarantined it becomes unclean until evening. Likewise, whoever lies down in the house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. So whoever goes in becomes unclean. Whatever enters in must be washed. So here's the second possibility. If, on the other hand, the priest comes in and makes an inspection, and the mark has not spread in the house after the house has been replastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean because the mark has not reappeared. To cleanse the house, then, he shall take 2 birds and cedar wood, a scarlet string, and hyssop. He shall slaughter the one bird in an earthen vessel over running water. Then he shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet string with the live bird and dip them in the blood of the slain bird as well as in the running water and sprinkle the house 7 times. He shall thus cleanse the house with the blood of the bird and with the running water, along with the live bird and with the cedar wood and with the hyssop and with the scarlet string. However, he shall let the live bird go free outside the city into the open field. So, here it is again. He shall make atonement. And here it is, an atonement for a house. And it will be clean. This is the law for any mark of leprosy. even for a scale, and for the leprous garment or house, for a swelling, and for a scab, and for a bright spot. Look at this purpose statement. Circle this, underline it, star it. To teach them when they are unclean and when they are clean. This is the law of leprosy. It's to do everything we've been talking about, to teach them just how defiled they really are, and just how impossible it is to stay clean. As if this wasn't enough, we have chapter 15. And this one is going to hit us even harder. The Lord also spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body. I'll leave that to your imagination. His discharge, get this, you'll be surprised, his discharge is unclean. This, moreover, shall be his uncleanness and his discharge. And it is his uncleanness, whether his body allows its discharge to flow, or whether his body obstructs its discharge. Again, leave it to your imagination. Every bed on which the person with the discharge lies becomes unclean. Everything on which he sits becomes unclean. Anyone, moreover, who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And whoever sits on the thing on which the man with the discharge has been sitting shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Also, whoever touches the person with the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Or, if the man with the discharge spits on one who is clean, he too shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. In other words, don't make a man that has a discharge mad at you, because he'll spit on you and he'll make you unclean. And he'll make you be out of your life until evening. Now every saddle on which the person with the discharge rides becomes unclean. Whoever then touches any of the things which were under him shall be unclean until evening. I would think you could just save a lot of space and just say that one. But do you get just how rigorous this was? Every single thing that this guy would touch, or any single thing that fluids from his body would touch, or anybody that touched him, was to be then unclean. Likewise, the one whom the discharge touches, without having rinsed his hands in water, shall wash his clothes. You'd be listening real hard for the sink water flowing. And bathe in water and be unclean until evening. However, an earthenware vessel which the person with the discharge touches shall be broken. Every wooden vessel shall be rinsed in water. Now when the man with the discharge becomes cleansed from his discharge, then whenever it's over, then he shall count off for himself 7 days for his cleansing. He shall then wash his clothes, bathe in running water, and he will become clean. Then on the 8th day, he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and come before the Lord to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. And the priest shall offer them, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. So the priest shall circle it, make atonement on his behalf before the Lord, this time because of his discharge. At any time, something like this could happen to a guy, and they would become unclean. And then every single thing or person that he touches or is touched or touches him becomes unclean. So you could pretty much be walking down the street, bump shoulders with a guy who had this discharge, and become unclean. And you'd never know it. Hopefully you would never know it. Do you see just how impossible it is, truly, to remain clean under these laws? It's impossible. It gets even worse. Now, verse 16. This is just a normal thing that happens. Now, if a man has a seminal emission, yes, it means what you think it means. He shall bathe all his body in water and be unclean until evening. As for any garment or any leather on which there is seminal emission, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. If a man lies with a woman so that there is a seminal emission, they shall both bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Now, this sets the people of Israel apart from all the other nations and from pretty much every other religion that has ever existed. Why? Because, if we could use the term before it existed, paganism, and you all know what I mean by that, paganism is usually built upon sexual encounters. Worship in paganism, and you can go back and read all of that if you can find it, is all about lying with sexual priestesses, or it is all about having relations together in one big building, and you can read about that pretty much in any history book. But the worship of Yahweh and his house was not to be so. In fact, the man and the woman could not even enter into the tabernacle until evening. They were unclean after they had relations together. And so that meant then that their everyday life was governed by the tabernacle. Are we going to go to worship today? Will we need to go and be clean when we enter in? It would make you think about scheduling during festivals, during holy days. And so this is not a cult in which there was a lot of sexual promiscuity. In fact, it was just the opposite. It was pure. Now, another lovely topic. Verse 19. When a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything also on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean. This is probably familiar, right? We just went through this with the male discharge. It's the same here with the female discharge. Anyone who touches her bed shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean till evening. Whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. Whether it is on the bed or on the thing on which she is sitting, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. If a man actually lies with her, so that her menstrual impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. Okay? So the fall has even affected that. We'll leave it there. Verse 25. Now, if a woman has a discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity she is unclean. Any bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her like the bed of her menstruation. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, like her uncleanness at that time. Likewise, whoever touches them shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. When she becomes clean from her discharge, she shall count off for herself 7 days, and afterwards she will be clean. Then on the 8th day she shall take herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and bring them into the priest to the doorway of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer the one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. I'll make the same point here. Notice that for a male discharge and a female discharge, it's the same, right? It's the same ceremony, and it's the same results here. So the priest shall make atonement on her behalf before the Lord because of her impure discharge. Now a summary verse, verse 31. Thus you shall keep the sons of Israel separated from their uncleanness. Why? Look at this. So that they will not die in their uncleanness. How? By defiling my tabernacle that is among them. This is the law for the one with a discharge, for the man who has a seminal emission so that he is unclean by it, for the woman who is ill because of her menstrual impurity, for the one who has a discharge, whether a male or a female, or a man who lies with a woman. So then, these chapters are put into context right there for us. And I waited to do that until now. Why these chapters? Why chapters 11 through 14, and why here? Why do we need to know about clean and unclean? And why all of a sudden does it interrupt a narrative that just started in order to tell us about clean and unclean, about that which is good and about that which is abominable, about that which is useful and about that which is detestable. Why? All of a sudden. Because we just saw in chapter 10 the tabernacle become defiled. The tabernacle became defiled by priests even, by Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, bringing strange fire before the Lord. So that what happened? The Lord killed them in their uncleanness, right? And that's uncleanness too, to offer before the Lord what he didn't ask for. Remember we said any sin, so any anomia, any breaking of the law is in itself uncleanness. But that's on top of all this other uncleanness, which is not sin. But any sin is uncleanness. And so when they offered strange fire before the Lord and they did what the Lord told them not to do, and God killed them, well, it still means that they brought defilement into his tabernacle. And his tabernacle is supposed to be what? Holy, holy, holy. So that prepares us for the next chapter or two, because we have this question. What do we do then when the tabernacle itself, the dwelling of God, becomes stained with uncleanness? And it's going to happen, right? Because sinful people are going in and out of it. People who are being cleansed are going in and out of it. They're going to the priest and having him check. So even by not meaning to, they're dragging their defilements in and out of the tabernacle. Not only that, but their defilements are in the camp where the people are and where the tabernacle of the Lord is pitched. And so that means that the camp needs to be purified from all these things. Now we'll find that there is something that happened once a year to take care of all of that. And we know that as the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And so once a year, God provided for the temple or the tabernacle and the camp to be cleansed from all of it. It would be atoned for once a year. Now, as we've talked about already, just a few thoughts and we'll close. Everything in our lives then, as we've seen in these chapters, has been affected by the fall. Our bodies, our food, even our houses and our clothes, all affected by the fall. It makes us appreciate then Jesus, right? Because Jesus has cleansed us from all these things. Not only that, but Jesus is making all things new. So that one day it will all be righteous. So that the effects of the fall will be reversed, so that we will see a new heaven and a new earth, and we will see him reign in righteousness there. It makes us understand then just how desperately we need atonement, and it helps us to understand Romans chapter 8 when Paul says that everything, all creation groans for the redemption. It makes us think carefully about the gravity of worship. It makes us think very carefully about that, because we understand now just how holy God is and just how much he despises sin. So we think very carefully about our worship. We also submit to God. All these things were given almost a priori by God. He doesn't really give a lot of reasons for some of these things. Just, you shall do this because I am Yahweh and I am your God. And in other words, who then are you, O man, to talk back to your Creator? It makes us want to be dedicated to know God's will, right? The devout Jew would have known all of these ordinances by heart. We don't have to know all of this. We need to study it. We need to be familiar with it, but we're not under the old covenant. Praise the Lord. But we're under the new covenant with the same God. And he has given us their commands, and we're to know the commands so that we will do them, right? Whoever loves me, Jesus said, will recite my word. No, do what I say. Makes us want to be dedicated to know God's will, and of course that's found in the scriptures, just like it was for the Jews. And then everything must be considered in light of God's presence, right? They had to consider that because God was living in their midst. Now we have to consider that because God's not just here, God's here in each and every one of us. And he's here with us together. And so as individuals and as a group, as the church, we must be careful because God is in our midst. That refers us all the way back to gravity and worship. That refers us back to personal holiness. That refers us back to rejoicing. And friends, let's rejoice in the atonement that was made once and for all, not over and over and over and over and over, but the atonement made once for all in Christ. It's done, right? At the cross, he cried out, "It is finished." No more of all that ceremony, no more of all those rituals, everything that was pointed to. And I'm sure we could spend years talking about those chapters that we just looked at. All of it fulfilled. And one day, I think we'll know the fullness of everything that those were talking about. We looked at those in quite a broad overview, but yet what we saw was gold, right? Well, Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for everything that you're teaching us. Lord, make yourself holy in our eyes, that we would know your holiness, that we would understand your holiness, that we would be spurred on to walk according to your holiness, grieved day in and day out by this flesh and by the world around us, yearning and groaning for the redemption that is at hand. And to that end, then, your saints cry out, "Come, Lord Jesus, come, deliver us." In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I think we'll end with the benediction. I don't have anything else lined up, so the benediction, if you need it, it's in the pews. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. Be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. And the Lord has provided the way to have peace with him. And finally, now through Jesus Christ, we have peace with God. Go forth. Have a blessed week.